In 1987, inside American stereo stores, traditional wooden hi-fi speakers began to vanish. In their place sat two tiny plastic cubes, small enough to hide in a single hand. The heavy bass module was shoved out of sight behind a couch. Yet when the salesman lifted the demonstration veil, the massive sound filling the room did not come from towering walnut cabinets. It came from the cubes. This was the Bose Acoustimass 5. It bypassed traditional hi-fi dealers, conquered big box retail, and became the ultimate suburban status symbol. Audiophiles were outraged, but the American living room had been reclaimed. The paradox is that Acoustimass did not disappear because America stopped listening. It disappeared because the exact convenience that made it necessary would soon expose a fatal physical flaw. The real story of the Bose Acoustimass is not merely about a hidden bass module. It is the story of how the American desire for invisible sound destroyed the traditional stereo pair, only to be destroyed itself by a single bar of plastic. Every week we tell the stories of American speakers, audio brands, stereo stores, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, movies, and memory. And what happened when the market moved on? Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, Audiophiles, in Framingham, Massachusetts, in 1987. In the early 1980s, the American living room was still built around a physical altar of sound. For a generation, high fidelity had been synonymous with size. If an American listener wanted a stereo system that could accurately reproduce the weight of a kick drum, the resonance of a bass guitar, or the full dynamic range of a symphony, the laws of physics demanded a large box. A woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies, required a massive volume of trapped air inside a cabinet to control its movement and project bass into a room. You could not cheat the air. Therefore, American speaker manufacturers built heavy floor-standing furniture. Names like Acoustic Research, JBL, and Klipsch dominated stereo stores with massive walnut and oak cabinets. The speakers often stood 3 feet tall, weighed 50 pounds each, and claimed permanent real estate on the living room floor. This was the visual contract of American hi-fi. The listener surrendered physical space, and in return the speakers delivered full-range sound. For decades, that contract held. The stereo receiver glowed in the center, flanked by 2 towering boxes, and the room was complete. But by the mid-1980s, the culture of the American home was shifting. The post-war obsession with massive hi-fi equipment began to clash with modern interior design. Suburban homes prioritized clean sightlines, open spaces, and integrated decor. The towering wooden speaker cabinet, once a point of pride, was increasingly viewed as a cumbersome eyesore. In American stereo stores, audio dealers faced a growing, undeniable retail barrier. The industry bluntly referred to it as the wife acceptance factor, or WAF. It was a crude but highly accurate measurement of retail reality. A husband might walk into a showroom, listen to a massive pair of floor-standing speakers, and want to buy them, but the sale would be killed the moment his spouse saw the sheer size of the cabinets. Families still wanted the room-filling sound of a premium stereo system, but they actively resented the wooden boxes that delivered it. The American absence was no longer a lack of fidelity. It was a lack of invisibility. Traditional hi-fi companies largely ignored this shift. They believed that serious listeners would always make room for serious speakers. They continued to refine their large cabinets, assuming the market would bend to the engineering. In Framingham, Massachusetts, the Bose Corporation saw the same retail friction and chose to bend the engineering to the market. Amar Bose, a former Massachusetts Institute of Technology professor, had built his company on the principles of psychoacoustics, the scientific study of how the human brain and auditory system perceive sound. In 1968, Bose had already disrupted the American audio industry with the 901, a speaker that utilized reflected sound to mimic the acoustic behavior of a concert hall. But while the 901 was revolutionary, it was still a highly visible piece of furniture that required dedicated stands and precise room placement. To conquer the evolving 1980s living room, the engineers in Framingham knew they had to eliminate the visual presence of the speaker entirely, without losing the impact of the music. To do this, they exploited a biological loophole in human hearing. The human ear is highly sensitive to the direction of high and mid-range frequencies. When a cymbal crashes or a singer takes a breath, the brain instantly calculates exactly where that sound is coming from. But low frequencies behave differently. Bass is largely omnidirectional, meaning the sound waves spread out evenly in all directions. And the human auditory system struggles to localize the exact source of the origin. When a heavy bass note hits, the listener feels the energy pressurize the room, but they cannot easily point to the woofer that produced it. If the listener could not locate the bass, the Bose engineers realized, the woofer did not need to sit next to the tweeter. The traditional stereo pair could be violently fractured. This was the genesis of the Acoustimass acoustic design. The Framingham team decided to strip the heavy, air-moving woofers completely out of the main left and right speaker channels. They placed the low-frequency drivers inside a separate heavy enclosure, the bass module. Crucially, Bose refused to call this a subwoofer. A true subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies, usually below 80 Hz, was an established concept in professional audio. But the Bose bass module was different. Because the main speakers were going to be aggressively minimized, the module had to carry not only the deep bass, but also the lower mid-range, operating at frequencies well above what a traditional subwoofer would handle. With the low-frequency burden transferred to a hidden box, the remaining frequencies, the vocals, the guitars, the strings, the snare drums, were directed to tiny, dual-speaker arrays. These satellite speakers were startlingly small. Made of molded plastic rather than heavy wood veneer, they consisted of two independent cubes that could be twisted to reflect sound off the walls, maintaining Amar Bose's core philosophy of direct and reflected sound. Each cube was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. They could be mounted near the ceiling, hidden on a bookshelf, or tucked inconspicuously next to a lamp. Meanwhile, the heavy utilitarian bass module could be shoved behind a sofa, hidden behind a curtain, or tucked under an end table. The visual footprint of the American hi-fi system had been reduced by more than 90%. When Bose prepared to introduce the Acoustimass 5 system to the American market in 1987, it was not merely launching a new product line. It was introducing a fundamental disruption to how audio was sold. At the time, the hi-fi retail floor was a place of direct physical comparison. Customers walked down long aisles of large wooden boxes, switching an amplifier between speaker A and speaker B. The visual size of the cabinet was implicitly tied to the price tag and the acoustic expectation. The bigger the box, the bigger the sound. Bose was asking the American stereo store to sell a ghost. They were asking dealers to convince customers that a massive, room-shaking acoustic experience was originating from two tiny pieces of plastic. The engineering theory was sound. Now it had to survive the brutal floor of the American stereo store. In 1987, the Bose Corporation introduced the Acoustimass 5 speaker system to the American market. To the American consumer standing in a stereo store, the visual impact was jarring. It did not look like audio equipment. It looked like a minimalist architectural accessory. The traditional wooden speaker had been reduced to a satellite speaker, a very small speaker designed to reproduce only mid and high frequencies, relying on a separate unit for bass. Each of the two left and right stereo channels consisted of two identical molded plastic cubes stacked on top of one another. They were barely 3 inches wide. An American listener could wrap their fingers entirely around a single cube. Furthermore, the top cube could be twisted independently of the bottom one. This allowed the listener to aim one driver directly at the listening chair, while firing the other at a side wall to create reflected sound. Sound that bounces off quiescent walls, floors, or ceilings before reaching the listener. But the cubes were only half of the acoustic illusion. The heavy lifting was completely hidden away in the Acoustimass bass module. Unlike traditional bass cabinets, this heavy module had no fabric grill cloth. It had no visible driver pushing air into the room. The woofer was entirely locked away inside the enclosure. To achieve this, Bose utilized a bandpass enclosure. A speaker cabinet design where the woofer is hidden completely inside a divided box, firing sound through a port, using trapped air to mechanically filter out higher frequencies. The result was a featureless rectangular block that looked more like a small piece of ventilation equipment than a premium hi-fi component. Because it was engineered to only produce omnidirectional bass, the module could be shoved under a side table, hidden behind a heavy curtain, or tucked securely behind a living room sofa. The Acoustimass 5 launched with a retail price of roughly $1,000. In 1987, that was a serious financial investment, equivalent to more than 3 weeks of wages for the average American worker. A complete system, paired with a solid-state stereo receiver, an electronic component that combines a radio tuner, a preamplifier, and an amplifier to power the speakers, and a new compact disc player could easily push the final register tape past $1,500. For that same amount of money, a buyer could walk out of a stereo store with a pair of massive, highly respected Klipsch horns or acoustic suspension AR towers that weighed 50 pounds each. But Bose was no longer selling a comparison of wood veneer, crossover complexity, or driver size. They were selling the reclamation of the American living room. The true breakthrough of the Acoustimass system was not merely its psychoacoustic engineering, it was how it weaponized the retail demonstration. For decades, traditional American hi-fi was sold on objective spec sheets. Dealers talked about frequency response, how evenly a speaker reproduces low, middle, and high sounds. They talked about distortion, unwanted change added to the sound by the speaker, amplifier, or room. Bose rejected this objective paradigm entirely. They instructed their dealer network to hide the bass module. When an American family walked into a showroom, the salesperson would point to a massive pair of dummy speaker cabinets resting on the floor. They would play a dynamic piece of music, full of heavy kick drums and sparkling cymbals. The customers would nod, impressed by the massive soundstage coming from the large towers. Then, the salesperson would walk over, lift the dummy cabinets off the floor, and reveal that they were hollow, empty shells. The massive sound was actually coming from the tiny plastic cubes mounted inconspicuously on the wall, and a hidden box behind the counter. This theatrical reveal destroyed the traditional sales pitch. It was an experiential moat that competitors, armed only with their heavy walnut boxes and technical brochures, could not easily counter. Traditional companies like Advent, KLH, and Boston Acoustics were trapped by their own devotion to large cabinet acoustic suspension designs. They could not shrink their speakers to the size of a coffee mug without completely losing the low frequencies. Bose had seemingly broken the laws of physics, or at least found a highly profitable way to bypass them in the retail environment. The American consumer, especially the spouse who had previously vetoed large wooden cabinets, was instantly sold. Almost overnight, the Acoustimass 5 fractured the established hi-fi dealer network. Traditional high-end audio purists and small boutique stereo shops often refused to carry the system, dismissing the cubes as a plastic gimmick. But Bose did not need the traditional audiophile gatekeepers to achieve scale. The system rapidly conquered the shelves of national electronics chains like Circuit City. which realized the cubes were the perfect high-margin product for the increasingly affluent American suburb. Mall-based retailers like the Federated Group, regional New England audio powerhouses like Tweeter, and emerging big-box stores like Best Buy eagerly adopted the Acoustimass line. Lifestyle catalogs featured the cubes, not just as electronics, but as premium interior design solutions. Even legacy audio magazines like Stereo Review had to concede that the system delivered an astonishingly large stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, from an impossibly small footprint. The cubes began appearing in high-end New York apartments, sprawling California living rooms, professional waiting rooms, and upscale suburban homes across the country. The badge on the grille was not decoration. It was a promise about sound, and a promise that the equipment would disappear. The stereo pair had been fractured. And just as the cubes conquered the music listener, the American living room suddenly decided it wanted to become a movie theater. By the late 1990s, the American audio market experienced a violent systemic shift. The era of critical two-channel stereo listening, where a user sat precisely between two cabinets to evaluate a musical performance, was rapidly giving way to a new cultural obsession. The introduction of the DVD format and Dolby Digital 5.1 surround sound transformed the American living room. It was no longer just a place to listen to a record, it was a place to watch movies. But this new standard created a massive physical problem. A proper 5.1 home theater, a system of multiple speakers designed to replicate the immersive cinema audio experience inside a house, required a center channel for dialogue, two front channels for the main soundtrack, two rear surround channels for atmospheric effects, and a dedicated low-frequency box. Traditional American hi-fi companies like Cerwin-Vega, Polk Audio, and Klipsch responded by trying to sell consumers 5 large wooden cabinets. The resulting living rooms looked less like a home and more like a cluttered electronics warehouse. If the visual footprint of a stereo pair had been a difficult retail hurdle in 1987, the demand for 5 separate speakers became an absolute brick wall a decade later. No interior designer and very few suburban homeowners wanted heavy wooden boxes dominating every corner of their living space. The engineers in Framingham were perfectly positioned to exploit this physical crisis. Bose rapidly expanded their product line, introducing the Acoustimass 6, 10, and 15 surround sound systems. If hiding 2 cubes was a neat psychological trick, hiding 5 was considered an interior design miracle. The heavy bass module was engineered to handle the dedicated low-frequency effects channel alongside the lower mid-range for all 5 satellite speakers. The tiny dual cubes were mounted high on walls, tucked into the corners of bookshelves, and bracketed near ceilings. The utilitarian bass box was banished under end tables or hidden completely inside custom oak entertainment centers. To scale this operation, Bose bypassed the skeptical, traditional boutique hi-fi dealers. They built an unprecedented retail machine tailored for the modern American consumer. The Acoustimass systems became the undisputed premium anchors of the big box electronics boom. Walk into any Circuit City in Chicago, any Best Buy in Dallas, any regional audio powerhouse like Tweeter in New England, or any Magnolia Home Theater showroom in Seattle, and you would not see Bose products stacked on the regular, crowded metal shelves next to competing receivers. You would see the Bose kiosk. This dedicated standalone retail display was a masterclass in commercial psychology. It was a self-contained theater experience, planted right in the middle of a brightly lit department store. It featured a push-button demonstration, an integrated television screen, and a perfectly calibrated hidden bass module. Customers did not have to understand frequency response, amplifier impedance, or crossover slopes. They only had to press a glowing button, step onto the designated carpet square, and experience the sudden cinematic impact. In a sprawling American living room, where placing 5 massive wooden towers would have destroyed the carefully planned interior design. A family could insert the Jurassic Park DVD, hear a dinosaur's footstep violently pressurize the room, and watch the water ripple in the glass. All while the only visible technology was 5 tiny cubes blending into the wall paint. From the new housing subdivisions of Orange County, California, to the finished basement home theaters of Long Island, New York, the Acoustimass system became an undeniable suburban status symbol. It was the default premium audio upgrade for the American middle class. The system had perfectly solved the visual problem of home theater, but the engineering required to achieve that invisibility was quietly activating a mechanical trap. By the turn of the millennium, the Framingham engineers had effectively rewritten the visual language of the American listening room. The Bose Acoustimass 10 and 15 systems became the unquestioned anchors of the home theater in a box category. A home theater in a box, a bundled retail package that included all the necessary speakers for a surround sound system in a single carton, eliminated the confusing, piecemeal shopping experience of traditional hi-fi. American consumers no longer needed to match amplifier impedance to speaker sensitivity. They only needed to pick up a single, heavy box from the Best Buy warehouse floor, load it into the trunk of their car, and drive back to the suburbs. At the peak of this home theater boom, the scale of the Bose retail empire was staggering. The traditional stereo store, with its carpeted listening rooms and highly opinionated salespeople, was rapidly dying out, replaced by the massive warehouse-style aisles of big-box electronics retailers. While legacy American speaker brands like Klipsch and Polk fought brutally for a few inches of crowded metal shelving in these new stores, Bose floated above the fray. The dedicated Bose kiosk was planted in thousands of retail locations across the United States. It shielded the Acoustimass systems from direct A/B comparison with competing speakers. It controlled the lighting, the volume, and the movie selection. It was a closed ecosystem of demonstration, and it worked flawlessly. The company was reportedly shipping millions of the tiny plastic cubes. The distinctive twisted dual cube arrays became a recognizable architectural detail in American homes. They were mounted high in the corners of upscale Manhattan apartments. They were bracketed to the drywall of finished basements in Ohio. They flanked massive rear projection televisions in sprawling Texas living rooms. The brand possessed a level of cultural gravity that transcended traditional audio circles. Custom home theater installers, professionals hired to integrate audio and video into the walls of affluent homes, often found themselves in a frustrating paradox. An installer could offer a client a technically superior set of in-wall architectural speakers, but the American homeowner would frequently refuse. The homeowner wanted the Bose cubes. The badge itself had become the primary metric of quality. This was the absolute peak of the Acoustimass empire. The traditional towering wooden speaker cabinet had been successfully banished from the mainstream American living room. The heavy, air-moving woofers were safely hidden behind couches, disguised as end tables, or shoved into corners. The listener had their living space back, and the movie soundtracks felt appropriately massive. Bose had conquered the visual problem of home audio. They had given the American consumer exactly what they asked for: a speaker that was virtually invisible, backed by a bass presence that could rattle a picture frame. But the architectural triumph of the plastic cube relied on a physical connection. Every receiver, every bass module, and every satellite speaker required an unbroken chain of copper. The cubes were everywhere. But the exact convenience that made them necessary was about to expose a fatal physical flaw.